Preston Hargrove slid the invoice across his desk without reading it. 14 weeks of labor, every part catalogued, every torque value logged to the decimal, and the chief financial officer of Cascade Valley Regional Medical Center pushed it back like junk mail. The work was never formally authorized, he said. Wyatt Holloway stood there with grease still lining his knuckles and said nothing. Audrey Bellamy stood by the door, hands at her sides. Through the window, the Eurocopter EC-135 he had rebuilt from the gearbox out sat gleaming on the helipad. No pilot alive would fly it without his signature. Some stories about quiet men begin with a slam door. This one begins with silence. Stay with it. The silence is the loudest part. 3 months before that morning, Wyatt and his daughter Piper lived in a single-wide trailer at the edge of Cedar Bluff, Montana. The town sat in a valley between two mountain ranges, 18,000 people spread across ranches and old mining roads, and the trailer park on Ridgeline Drive was the cheapest address in any direction. Wyatt had sold the house in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, 6 months before that. The house where his wife Hannah had arranged the bookshelves by color, the house where she had died on the living room couch while Piper was at school, the cancer finishing what 18 months of treatment could not. He packed the photographs into a cardboard box and left the furniture for the estate sale. He drove west with Piper asleep in the passenger seat and the road unfolding through 3 states before it hit Montana, and kept going. Piper sat at the fold-down kitchen table most afternoons, reading a library book about helicopters. She had been drawing them since she was 4. She had grown up on a military post where they flew overhead before breakfast. "Daddy, when are we getting a real house?" she asked one Tuesday without looking up from her page. Wyatt poured her a glass of milk and said, "When the right one shows up, sweetheart." He found work around town the way quiet men with skilled hands always do. A rancher's diesel engine that had been sitting dead for 2 months. Wyatt had it running in 4 hours, a transmission rebuild for the hardware store owner, a hydraulic pump replacement on a hay baler that 3 other mechanics had given up on. People knew him as the mechanic from the trailer park. Polite. Kept to himself. Never talked about where he came from. Never overcharged. He was 40 years old. He wore the same canvas jacket through October, work boots on their second resole, hair cut short from habit. He had the bearing of a man who had once lived under tight schedules and had not yet figured out what to do with the slack. On a Friday afternoon in late September, a white hospital SUV with the Cascade Valley Regional Medical Center logo on the door pulled into the lot of Henley's garage. The woman who got out was 36 years old, direct in the way that came from years of managing pilots and paramedics who did not respond well to ambiguity. Her name was Audrey Bellamy. She walked to the bay where Wyatt was elbow-deep in a John Deere combine. She did not introduce herself first. She asked the garage owner if anyone local had experience with turboshaft engines. The owner pointed at Wyatt. Audrey turned and looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. He was wiping his hands on a rag. He did not look up until he was ready to. When he did, she felt the small, startled awareness people feel when they realize the person they have just walked up to is not who they expected to find in a place like this. "I have a problem," she said. "All right," Wyatt said. Audrey explained as they walked out to her vehicle. Cascade Valley operated a single EMS helicopter program, one Eurocopter EC-135 serving 4 counties across some of the most remote terrain in the northern Rockies. The aircraft had suffered a hard landing 3 weeks earlier. Damage to the main gearbox, the tail rotor assembly, and several structural mounts. The primary maintenance contractor out of Billings had inspected it, quoted $280,000, and recommended the hospital purchase a new aircraft. The flight program had been grounded ever since. Wyatt wiped his hands again and asked 3 questions. "What is the condition of the main gearbox input seal?" "I do not know." "Has the tail rotor drive shaft shown any lateral displacement during the post-incident inspection?" "I do not know." "And has anyone checked the engine deck mounts for hairline stress fractures along the forward attach points?" Audrey stopped walking. These were not the questions a general mechanic would think to ask. They were the questions of someone who had stood under a damaged airframe before and known where to look first. "I have worked on helicopters," Wyatt said, his voice even. "I can take a look if you want." She drove him to the hangar that afternoon. Wyatt circled the EC-135 slowly, opened panels, ran his fingers along the airframe seams the way a surgeon checks suture lines. He crouched beneath the fuselage and studied the belly with a flashlight for a long time. He pressed the pad of his thumb against a small dimple in the tail boom and held it there as if the metal might tell him something. When he stood up, he told Audrey he could rebuild it in 10 to 12 weeks. He would need to source specific components: a new main rotor gearbox, replacement tail rotor blades, several actuator assemblies. He would draw up a list. Audrey said she would handle the administrative side and get the paperwork moving. They shook hands. The agreement was professional, efficient, and entirely verbal. But she noticed something she could not yet name. The way Wyatt touched the aircraft was not curiosity, it was recognition. The way a man touches something he has been away from for too long. He started work the following Monday. He arrived at 7, laid his tools out in a precise grid on a rolling cart, and began the disassembly with the methodical calm of a man following a checklist that existed only in his muscle memory. Piper came after school each day, dropped her backpack in the corner near a space heater, and sat on a folding chair with her colored pencils and a sketch pad. The hangar became their second home. Duke Mercer noticed first. Duke was 59, the lead pilot of the EMS program, a former Army aviator who had flown Hueys in the late 80s and Black Hawks through the 90s before transitioning to civilian work. He leaned against the hangar doorframe most afternoons, watching Wyatt without saying much. What he saw puzzled him. The work was too precise. The way Wyatt indexed gearbox components before removal, using a numbering system that matched no civilian manual Duke had ever seen. The way he torqued fasteners in the exact star pattern from military technical orders. The way he handled the tail rotor assembly with the unconscious efficiency of a man who had done it hundreds of times. In the third week, Wyatt rolled up his sleeves to reach a coupling buried deep inside the transmission housing. Duke, standing 6 feet away, saw the tattoo on the inside of his left wrist. Small, faded to blue-gray, easy to miss if you did not know what you were looking at. A winged Pegasus above a sword and a crescent moon. The insignia of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. Duke set his coffee down. He waited until Piper left for the restroom, then walked over and stood close enough that only Wyatt could hear him. "When did you get out?" Wyatt's hands stopped moving. The two men looked at each other for 3 seconds, and in that hangar, 3 seconds was enough. 3 years ago, Wyatt said quietly. Chief Warrant Officer 4, 14 years in, maintenance test pilot. Black Hawks and Chinooks across multiple deployments. I would appreciate it if that stayed between us. Duke nodded slowly. Something shifted behind his eyes. Across the hangar, Audrey had come in carrying 2 coffees. She saw Duke step back from the cart. His face changed in a way she could not read. She did not ask. She walked over with the cups and set one on the workbench beside Wyatt's elbow. "You take it black, right?" "I do." She glanced once at Duke. Duke gave her nothing. She walked back to the door, and behind her she felt the shape of a thing she did not yet have the words for. That same week, Wyatt discovered a problem nobody had flagged. Deep inside the main drivetrain, a bearing race showed micro-pitting, tiny surface craters invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under a borescope. The pitting would pass a ground-run vibration check, but at 120 knots it would produce a harmonic shimmy that a pilot might ignore once, dismiss twice, and feel tear something loose on the third flight. He added the repair to his work scope without adding it to the invoice, because rebuilding a helicopter halfway was the same as not rebuilding it at all. Audrey began visiting the hangar more frequently. At first it was progress checks, clipboard in hand, questions about the timeline. Then the clipboard disappeared. She started bringing coffee in a thermos, pouring it into 2 mismatched mugs from the break room. She asked about Piper's school, about the trailer park, whether the heater worked. Wyatt answered in short sentences that were not unfriendly, just careful. One afternoon, Piper ran across the hangar floor clutching a new drawing. The EC-135 in flight, rendered in blue and white with a yellow sun behind it. She presented it to Audrey with the radiant confidence of an 8-year-old who had decided this was the person who should have it. Audrey crouched down. "This is the best helicopter I have ever seen. It is Daddy's helicopter." "I know it is." Piper looked at her for a beat longer, the way children do when they are deciding whether to trust a person, and then she nodded and ran back to her sketchpad. Wyatt watched them from 20 feet away. His wrench paused mid-turn. For a long moment, he forgot what he had been tightening. He had not seen anyone speak to Piper that way since the funeral. Not the school counselor, not the neighbor with the casserole, not the woman from the trailer park office who tried too hard. Audrey had not tried at all. She had just crouched down and looked at the drawing. When Audrey straightened up and walked over, she saw the expression on his face before he could put it away. "She is bright," Audrey said. "She is. What is she reading?" "An aviation history. She found a book on the Sikorsky family last week. She has opinions now." Audrey smiled. It was a brief, surprised smile, and she covered it with the rim of her mug. She did not stay long after that. She had a meeting back at the hospital. When she left, Wyatt stood looking at the spot where she had crouched, and then he picked the wrench back up and finished the turn he had forgotten. That night, after Piper fell asleep in the narrow bed at the back of the trailer, he sat on the metal steps outside. The October air was cold enough to see his breath. He thought about how long it had been since a stranger had said the word she about his daughter in a way that did not feel like pity. He did not sleep until almost 2. Audrey submitted the budget authorization request for Wyatt's contract to Preston Hargrove on a Wednesday morning. She had documented everything: scope of work, estimated costs, timeline, Wyatt's qualifications as she understood them, the fact that his quote was a fraction of what the Billings contractor had assessed. She emailed the package, printed a hard copy, and hand-delivered it to Preston's corner office on the administrative floor. Preston had known about Wyatt's work from the beginning. He had seen the emails. He had heard Audrey's progress reports in the weekly staff meetings. He had nodded along and said things like, "Keep me posted," without ever putting a signature on a purchase order. The omission was deliberate. For 18 months, Preston had been quietly lobbying the hospital's board of directors to discontinue the EMS helicopter program entirely. It was expensive. Fuel, liability insurance, pilot salaries, maintenance contracts, hangar fees. He had been building a financial case to replace helicopter transport with long-range ground ambulance contracts through a company called Med Transit West, a company in which he held an undisclosed equity stake. A functioning, affordable helicopter undermined that case. A permanently grounded one supported it. "There is no authorized purchase order," Preston told Audrey, his voice flat and practiced. "Any verbal agreement you made with this individual carries no legal weight." Audrey pushed back. She had email threads, messages from the medical director, from the chief nursing officer, all acknowledging the repair project, all expressing urgency about returning the aircraft to service. "Emails are not contracts," Preston said. He closed the folder and placed his hands flat on the desk, a gesture that meant the conversation was over. She drove to the hangar that afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Wyatt route a new hydraulic line along the belly of the airframe with the steady, unhurried hands of a man who trusted his own precision more than most people trusted anything. "There is a problem with the payment authorization on the administrative side," she said. "I am working through it." Wyatt looked at her. He nodded once. He picked up a torque wrench. He did not ask about the money. He did not ask how long it would take. After her vehicle pulled out of the lot, his hands paused on the wrench. He stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the airframe without seeing it. Piper, sitting in the corner, watched him from over the top of her book. She did not say anything. She had learned the difference between her father being quiet and her father being still. She closed the book, walked across the hangar, and put her hand on the back of his. He looked down. "It is okay, Daddy." He turned his hand over and held hers for a second. "I know, sweetheart." She went back to her chair. That night, after Piper was asleep, Wyatt sat on the metal steps outside the trailer. The air was cold enough to see his breath. He opened his banking app and looked at the balance. Enough for groceries, lot rent, Piper's school lunch account, and gas for another 5 or 6 weeks. After that, the math stopped working. He closed the phone. He leaned back against the trailer door and looked up. The Montana sky was enormous and cold and crowded with stars, and it offered him nothing except the ancient indifferent reminder that the universe did not keep ledgers. He had bet everything he had on a handshake with a woman he barely knew, and the house was already playing against him. His phone buzzed at 10:45. Audrey. Her voice was tired, stripped of the professional composure she wore during the day, and underneath it he could hear something raw and personal she probably had not intended to let through. "I am not going to let them do this to you." Wyatt was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched across the phone line like a held breath. Then he said, "I know you will not." 3 words, but they carried the weight of a trust that had been forming without permission, assembling itself quietly in the space between coffee mugs and helicopter parts and afternoons spent in a hangar where an 8-year-old girl drew pictures of flight. Audrey closed her eyes. She held the phone against her ear and let the silence stay. "How is Piper?" she asked finally. "Asleep. Good. She made you another drawing today. I will bring it tomorrow. Tell her thank you." Neither of them moved to hang up. The line stayed open while they breathed on either side of it. Outside the trailer, the wind picked up across the valley. Somewhere down the row of single wides, a dog barked once and stopped. "Wyatt," Audrey said. "Yes, I want you to keep going." "I am. I want you to finish it." "I will." She hung up first, because she had to, because if she did not, she was going to say something else, and she had not earned the right to say it yet. Wyatt sat for a long time looking at the dark phone in his hand. Then he stood up, opened the trailer door quietly, and went inside. Piper had kicked off her blanket in her sleep. He pulled it back up over her shoulders. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. For the first time since Hannah died, he allowed himself to think about what it would mean to let one more person inside the door. He did not let himself think about it for long, but he let himself think about it. In the morning, he was at the hangar by 6:30. Wyatt drove the last bolt home on a Thursday morning in early January, 14 weeks after he had started. He ran the ground tests methodically. Engine start sequence. Rotor engagement. Full systems check. Vibration analysis at multiple RPM bands. Every parameter came back within specification. Several came back tighter than factory numbers. Duke stood on the tarmac with his arms crossed and watched the rotors turn for the first time in 4 months. The sound building from a low whine to the deep rhythmic thrum that anyone who has lived around helicopters can feel in their sternum. "That is not a rebuild," Duke said. "That is a resurrection." Wyatt spent the next 2 days completing the maintenance records, every step documented, every replacement part cataloged with manufacturer's serial numbers, lot codes, and installation dates, every torque value logged to the decimal in both foot-pounds and Newton-meters. The documentation followed FAA Part 1, 35 airworthiness standards, with a thoroughness no civilian contractor in Montana would have matched. 412 pages in total. At the back of the maintenance file, on the final page, there was a single blank line, the return to service release. Requiring the signature of the mechanic who had performed the work, Wyatt submitted his invoice to hospital administration. $47,000. Labor. Specialized parts he had purchased from his own savings. Professional consultation fees. The total was roughly 1/6 of what the Billings contractor had quoted to do the same work, or more accurately, to not do it, and recommend buying a new aircraft instead. Preston met Wyatt in his office. It was the same desk, the same invoice, the same man behind the desk with his hands folded. Audrey stood by the door. Preston slid the invoice back without reading it. No authorized purchase order, no signed contract, no legal obligation. He straightened his tie and said, "You should have known better than to work without a formal agreement." Wyatt looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not lean forward. "The helicopter is ready," he said. "Whether you pay me or not does not change what I put into it." He turned and walked out of the office. Audrey followed. In the hallway, she caught up to him near the elevator. "I am taking this to the board," she said, her voice tight. "This is theft, Wyatt." He stopped walking. He turned and looked at her. There was something in his expression she had not seen before. Not defeat, a deep and practiced familiarity with being failed by institutions that were supposed to be better. "Do not fight this one for me," he said quietly. "Fight it for the next person they do this to." He stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Audrey stood in the empty corridor with her hands trembling at her sides. 11 days passed. Wyatt went back to work, not at the hangar, at Henley's garage, under trucks and tractors and irrigation pumps, where the jobs were small and the checks cleared. On the 11th day, the dispatch radio in the EMS coordination room crackled with an emergency call. Multi-vehicle accident on the Pass Road, 47 miles east of Cedar Bluff. One patient critical. Suspected spinal cord injury. Helicopter transport requested. Audrey stood in the coordination room next to her flight dispatcher and watched the man's face as he confirmed what everyone already knew. The EC-135 was not cleared for flight. A ground ambulance was dispatched instead. 3 hours on narrow mountain roads. The patient survived, barely stabilized at Cascade Valley with injuries that would have responded better to the 22-minute flight that should have been available. That evening, Duke knocked on Audrey's office door. He sat down without being asked. He looked at her for a long time before he spoke. "There is something I need to tell you about Wyatt Holloway." Audrey looked up. "He was a chief warrant officer 4 in the United States Army," Duke said. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, 14 years. Maintenance test pilot. He is one of the most qualified rotary wing maintenance technicians alive in this country. He does not know I am telling you this. I am telling you because the people in this building are about to do something they will not be able to take back, and they need to know who they are doing it to. Audrey did not speak for almost a minute. Why did he never tell anyone? Because he did not come to Montana to be that man. He came here to be Piper's father. Audrey found Wyatt at Henley's garage that evening. She did not come to ask him to sign the release. She sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket next to his workbench and said, "I want you to know what happened today." She told him about the accident, the patient, the 3-hour drive that should have been a flight. Wyatt listened without moving. His jaw tightened incrementally with each detail, his eyes fixed on the stained concrete floor. When she finished, the garage was quiet except for the tick of a cooling engine block and the distant sound of a truck on the highway. "I knew he would not pay me," Wyatt said. "I did not think he would let someone die over his pride." It was not a refusal to sign, and Audrey knew it. It was something more layered, the position of a man who understood that a return-to-service signature carried personal legal liability, and who could not attach that liability to an organization that had formally denied he was the person responsible for the work. If the hospital did not recognize him as the mechanic of record, then he was not the mechanic of record. And a mechanic who did not exist on paper could not sign a document that required him to exist on paper. The logic was airtight. The principle underneath it was immovable. Audrey sat with that silence. She did not argue. She understood. After a long time, she put her hand on the workbench near his, not touching, but close enough that they could both feel the warmth. "Duke told me," she said. Wyatt did not look up. "He should not have. He did not tell anyone else. He should not have told you either." "I know," Audrey said, "but I am glad he did." Wyatt finally looked at her. Whatever was behind his eyes was not anger. It was the tired, careful weighing of a man who had spent his life deciding what to let other people know. "You cannot use it," he said. "I will not. Promise-me." "I promise." She stood up. She did not say goodnight. She walked back to her car in the cold January dark and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel before she started the engine. Preston made one more move. He contracted an outside aviation maintenance firm from Denver to fly in, re-inspect the EC-135, and issue their own return-to-service sign-off. The Denver crew, 2 airframe and power plant mechanics and a lead inspector, spent 2 full days going through Wyatt's maintenance records and examining the aircraft. When they finished, their lead inspector sat down with Preston and Audrey in the conference room and delivered his assessment. "Whoever did this work is military grade," he said. "The documentation is the most thorough I have seen on a civilian airframe in 20 years. But we cannot sign off on another mechanic's work. That is his personal liability, his certification, and his signature. If you want our name on the release, we would need to strip the aircraft to bare metal and start the entire rebuild from scratch." He quoted $210,000 and a 12-week timeline. Preston's face went white. The Denver crew packed their tools and flew home the next morning. Preston assembled his final play. A settlement offer. $15,000. Roughly 1/3 of the invoice, contingent on Wyatt signing both the return-to-service release and a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent him from discussing the terms of the settlement, the circumstances of the contract, or the hospital's role in any of it. Audrey was instructed to deliver the offer. She drove to the garage that afternoon, not because she supported the terms, because her position required her to transmit them. She handed Wyatt the envelope and leaned against the workbench with her arms crossed, watching his face. Wyatt read the document standing up. He read it slowly and completely, the way a man reads something he intends to refuse, not for information, for the precise shape of the insult. He folded the paper once, set it on the workbench, rested his hand on top of it. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I spent 14 years in a job where people died because someone torqued a bolt 2 pounds short. I never cut a corner, and I am not going to sign a non-disclosure agreement to provide cover for a man who does." Audrey looked at him. The garage was cold and smelled of motor oil and old concrete. The late afternoon light came through the bay door at an angle that lit the side of his face and left the rest in shadow. She did not see a mechanic. She saw a man whose integrity was structural, load-bearing, built into the foundation, impossible to remove without bringing down the whole house. She understood, in the quiet and certain way such things arrive, that she had been falling into this man's gravity for weeks, and that she had no interest in pulling free. She nodded once. She took the envelope back. "I will tell him. Thank you." She turned to leave. At the bay door she stopped. "Wyatt." "Yes." "Piper's drawing. The one she made me. I have it on my desk." He nodded. He did not say anything. She walked out. 2 days later, Piper rode her bicycle to the hospital after school. She did not go inside. She did not ask to see anyone. She walked across the parking lot to the hangar. The hangar was padlocked. She took a folded piece of paper out of her backpack. A new drawing, the EC-135 flying against a bright blue sky. Across the bottom, in the careful, oversized handwriting of an 8-year-old, it read, "Daddy fixed it." She taped it to the hangar door at her eye level. She stepped back and looked at it for a moment, the way a curator might examine a painting she had decided to leave in a public place. Then she got back on her bike and rode home before the light went. Audrey found the drawing the next morning when she arrived for work. She stood in front of it for a full minute, breathing through her nose, pressing her lips together. Then she walked into the hangar through the side door, took the drawing carefully down, and carried it to her office. She closed the door. She opened her laptop. She spent the next 3 hours building a case file. Every email, the complete project timeline, Wyatt's invoice, his maintenance records, all 412 pages, the Denver inspection team's written assessment, Preston's refusal letter, the EMS dispatch logs showing emergency calls that could not be answered. She packaged the entire file into a single submission and emailed it to every member of the hospital board of directors. She copied the hospital's general counsel. She did not copy Preston. She understood that this could end her career. She sent it anyway. Then she taped Piper's drawing to the wall behind her desk where she could see it. The board convened an emergency session on a Tuesday evening. 12 members seated around the long walnut table in the hospital's 4th-floor conference room. Preston sat at one end, his jaw working silently. Audrey stood at the other with a laptop, a projector, and a folder thick enough to stop a door. She presented the case with the same methodical precision she brought to flight program logistics. The Billings contractor's original repair quote, $280,000. Wyatt Holloway's total invoice for the completed rebuild, $47,000. The Denver inspection team's written assessment of his workmanship, flawless, military grade, documentation exceeding anything they had seen in the civilian sector. The estimated cost of Preston's proposed alternative of full reinspection and recertification by a new firm, $210,000 minimum. The EMS program dispatch logs showing 2 emergency calls requiring helicopter transport that could not be fulfilled, including patient outcomes. She was halfway through the financial comparison when the dispatch radio in the adjacent room activated. The conference room's overhead speaker was patched into the EMS frequency. Standard procedure during any board meeting that involved the flight program. Everyone heard the call. A 9-year-old boy, injured on a cattle ranch in the neighboring county, crushed trauma from an overturned piece of farm equipment, critical condition, requesting air transport to Cascade Valley. The room went silent. Every board member turned toward the speaker as the dispatcher's voice confirmed what they all already knew. The EC-135 was not cleared for flight. A ground ambulance had been dispatched from the nearest station. Estimated time to reach the patient, 43 minutes. Estimated transport back to Cascade Valley, another 51 minutes. Total time from injury to surgical suite, nearly 2 hours. Dr. Eleanor Prescott, the senior trauma surgeon on the board, set her pen down on the table with a small, precise click. Preston attempted to partition the discussion. The flight program's operational status and this contract matter are 2 separate issues that should be addressed in. Dr. Prescott stood up. "No," she said. The single syllable cut the room in half. "This is exactly the issue. You saved this hospital $47,000, and the price tag is the safety of the people we are chartered to serve." She looked around the table. "I move to authorize full and immediate payment of the invoice." The vote was 11-1. Full payment. Immediate release of funds. A formal internal investigation into Preston Hargrove's handling of the flight program budget and his relationship with Med Transit West. Audrey stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and called Wyatt. "The invoice has been approved," she said. "Full amount. Can you come sign the release?" There was silence on the other end of the line. Not hesitation. Something closer to a man letting out a breath he had been holding for 6 weeks. Then his voice, quiet and steady. "I will be there in 20 minutes. Wyatt pulled into the hospital parking lot 17 minutes later. Piper was with him. He walked across the tarmac to the hangar where Duke, 2 other pilots, Audrey, and a half-dozen flight nurses and paramedics were already waiting. No one spoke. The hangar lights were on. The EC-135 sat in the center of the floor like something waiting to be released. Wyatt walked straight to it. He opened 3 inspection panels, checked the main rotor head, ran his hands along the tail boom, knelt beside the skids to inspect the lower airframe, not because he doubted any of it, because a man who had spent his career keeping people alive at altitude did not skip steps. Even when the steps were ceremonial, he stood. He opened the maintenance logbook to the final page. He took a pen from his shirt pocket. He signed his name on the return to service release. Duke stepped forward. He took Wyatt's hand and held the grip for a beat longer than a handshake requires, the way one soldier grips another. "It is good to fly with you, Chief." It was the first time anyone in Cedar Bluff had addressed Wyatt by his military title. Wyatt nodded. His eyes were bright. He did not look away. 20 minutes later, the rotors spun up for a check flight. Duke lifted the EC-135 off the helipad, and the downwash swept across the tarmac in a wave that smelled of kerosene and cold Montana air. Wyatt stood on the ground and watched the aircraft climb. The sound filled the valley. Audrey stood beside him, not close enough to touch. Close enough that the rotor wash moved between them like a shared breath, pressing their jackets flat, rearranging everything. Piper had been waiting just inside the open hangar door with one of the flight nurses. When the rotors cleared the building, she ran out across the tarmac. She wrapped her arms around Wyatt's leg and looked up. "Daddy, I see it. Your helicopter is flying." Wyatt reached down and lifted her onto his hip. Piper pointed at the sky with both hands and laughed into the wind. Audrey watched them. The tall, quiet man and the small girl framed against the gray sky and the rising aircraft. She smiled in a way that reached places she had stopped visiting years ago. Preston Hargrove was asked to resign 15 days later. The board's investigation confirmed the undisclosed financial interest in MedTransit West, and the matter was referred to the state attorney general. Preston's departure was not dramatic. There was no confrontation in the hallway. No public statement. No satisfaction. He left the building on a Friday afternoon with a banker's box and a face that suggested he had already begun constructing a version of events in which none of this was his fault. No one watched him go. There was nothing to see. Just the quiet arithmetic of a man who had treated people as expenses finally being subtracted from the ledger himself. 1 month later, Cascade Valley Regional Medical Center offered Wyatt Holloway a full-time contract as Chief Aviation Maintenance Technician. Salary, health insurance, dental, retirement, all of it. Wyatt signed the contract on a Monday. He and Piper moved out of the trailer park the following weekend into a small 2-bedroom house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from Piper's school. It had a yard with a cottonwood tree, a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs, a kitchen table that did not fold into the wall. Piper taped the drawing to her bedroom wall that first night. The one that read "Daddy" fixed it. She smoothed the corners carefully and stepped back to look at it the way a curator examines a painting. Wyatt stood in her doorway, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her settle into a room that was hers, not borrowed, not temporary, not a narrow space at the back of a trailer that shook when the wind blew. His face held the expression of a man who had become so accustomed to impermanence that stability felt like a foreign language, and who was now, for the first time in 3 years, allowing himself to learn it again. Audrey came to the hangar at the end of a Wednesday shift. Wyatt was wiping grease from his hands with a blue shop rag. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. The faded Pegasus tattoo was visible in the overhead fluorescent light. She set a cup of coffee on the workbench, the same gesture she had made dozens of times before. This time she pulled up a stool, sat down, and stayed. They talked about the upcoming 100-hour inspection, about Piper's parent-teacher conference, about whether Montana winters were genuinely worse than Kentucky ones, or just differently cold. They talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. The hangar was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights and the occasional distant sound of a truck passing on the highway. They did not talk about what was happening between them. They did not need to. It was already there, patient, structural, built from months of shared silence and small gestures and a trust that had been tested and had held. When Audrey stood to leave, Wyatt spoke. Audrey. It was the first time he had used her first name instead of Miss Bellamy. She turned. He looked at her with the steady, unhurried gaze of a man who chose words the way he selected tools, carefully, one at a time, matched precisely to the task. Thank you, he said, not for the contract, for believing the work mattered. Audrey looked at him. She nodded once, slowly, then she smiled. Not the professional smile, not the composed one, the kind that arrived without permission, the kind a person did not plan or rehearse or control, the kind that changed the temperature of everything it touched. She left. Wyatt stood on the helipad at dusk. The Montana sky was wide and copper-streaked and fading at the edges. The EC-135 sat in the lit hangar behind him, fueled and ready for the next call. Piper was home in a room that belonged to her, in a house that would still be there in the morning. Audrey had driven away an hour ago, but the coffee she had brought him was still warm in his hands, somewhere beyond the mountains, in the valleys and along the switchback roads. The helicopter he had rebuilt from nothing was keeping people alive, and Wyatt Holloway, the man who had once ensured the safety of the most classified rotary-wing aircraft in American military history, had finally found his own ground to stand on. He had not been looking for recognition. She had not been looking for someone to trust. But in a small hangar in Cedar Bluff, Montana, they had both found the thing they did not know they had been missing.